Okay, hi everybody. I want to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us for our third Climate Friday talk this semester. This event is sponsored by the Center for Sustainable Development, which provides students with the opportunities and resources to engage in our community sustainably. At the center and at the college, we define sustainability as the integration of the 5 pillars that make up sustainability. We can define sustainability as the integration of social, economic, environmental, political, and personal systems. These pillars are social, economic, environmental, political, and personal. Addressing issues with the 5 pillars equips students with the sustainability literacy, giving one the skills and knowledge to tackle 21st century problems. Within the 5 pillars is the specific triple bottom line of sustainability, where the 3, economic, you may also hear equity, environmental and social systems meet and intersect. These systems are necessary in the construction of individual, institutional, community, regional, and planetary resilience. Along the triple bottom line, the integration of personal and political systems encourage students to approach sustainability from multiple perspectives. This could be encouraging fellow students and peers to make small adjustments in their daily lives, to include more sustainable behaviors and enhancing sustainability literacy by taking courses that are taught by faculty across the curricula. Or it could be using our skills of sustainability to apply our knowledge to create and advocate for a more resilient and equitable future for all. Today's Climate Friday event, focusing on Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty in the context of climate change, highlights the critically important nature of understanding the unequal power dynamics in social, political, economic, personal, and environmental systems between settler colonialists and Indigenous communities, and how dismantling these unequal power regimes is needed to both understand and ultimately to solve 21st century problems. Through this event, you'll hear various issues that impact the 5 pillars in some way to help solve 21st century problems, or hear about personal actions you can take in your life to do the same. These events relate to CFC's 2020 and 2021 Sustains and Solves theme of global warming and climate change. We know that global warming will disproportionately impact some populations compared to others, and some geographic regions harder than others. This is why climate justice is central to understanding global warming, absolutely central. Given Charleston's location and future models, we are in a very climate vulnerable community and must work together to adapt to global warming and to mitigate what's coming. It is hoped by viewing this issue through the triple bottom line and the center's 5 pillars, you'll be able to better advocate for adaptive solutions to climate change in your life and in your community. So our speaker today, we're so happy to have with us today, is Annette Watson. Dr. Watson came to the college's political science department in 2008, actually the same time I came to the college. After obtaining her PhD in geography at the University of Minnesota, her teaching at both the undergraduate and graduate level through these years has broadly focused on the politics of community-based research and research methods that engage interdisciplinary social and natural sciences. In her administrative life at the college, she has taken turns leading the political science department's undergraduate minor in geography and developing a community of geographic-minded scholars across the college. In 2016, she became the director of the Environmental and Sustainability Studies graduate program at the college, and this year finishes out her 5-year term in that role. She shares with us today her experiences facilitating cross-cultural and diverse communities of knowers in her research life, focused on the various climate crises that affect all of us in different ways. Her talk is going to be about 30 minutes, which leaves us plenty of room for Q&A at the end. So please submit questions that you may have in the chat function, and we'll be able to get those to her. Thank you, and take it away, Annette.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for that great introduction. And thank you again for the Center for Sustainable Development and inviting me to share some of my experiences on working with different Indigenous groups around the world, really. And I'm gonna give you an overview of what I've learned in that process, what sort of take-home messages I like to provide for my students who may or may not be Indigenous themselves. And then we can talk a little bit further about the challenges of what I'm going to talk about, which is decolonizing methodologies. So as it was explained, I have my PhD in geography. I'm a geographer, and I've been mostly doing ethnographic research, meaning that I go out and hang out with people, people who I don't share a similar background with necessarily. And here, for example, is an image of myself with some collaborators of mine on the Yukon River in Alaska, amidst an absolute downpour on the Yukon. And here I was working on a long-term project understanding the knowledge of fisheries, specifically the Chinook salmon fishery, and going out probably 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours a day, 3 days a week for about 6 years is what I worked on this particular project. And luckily of all those moments, there were very few moments of an open downpour like the one that's captured in this photograph. But every moment has been special to me and very memorable with these experiences. And I've been very privileged to be invited to many of these spaces that I myself have not been a community member of. And so I've been doing community-based research, right, involving participant observation, like what you see here in the photos. I've done a lot of interviewing, archival research, some video and visual ethnography, and also some GIS analysis work. And these projects have been variously funded from mostly US federal agencies, as well as CFC, the National Science Foundation, the National Park Service, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, all of these mostly land and environmental agencies that really want to learn from these constituencies about the climate system and about the ecological system more broadly. And so where and with whom I've worked, if those of you that don't know where I've been, I spend a lot of time in Alaska in the Arctic. And so I've collaborated most intensively with Koyukon Athabascan tribes, as well as a few land-based Inuit nations in more intensive participant observation experiences. I've worked in the Low Country with some Gullah Geechee communities, especially those on St. Helena Island, in Mount Pleasant, and in North Charleston especially. And I've also broadened that experience of working with Indigenous representatives in more political fora like the Arctic Council, where I've learned a lot from the Yupik representatives, Inuit, Gwich'in, Sami, Koryak, and Itelmen in my more recent work with the Arctic Council and the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. And I write about all these people and list out all of these names because even though I'm talking about Indigenous knowledge, it's important to recognize that this is not a monolith, this idea of Indigenous knowledge, that there are many very specific traditions and ideas that stem from each one of these particular cultural groups here, but that we often have to talk about this broader entity called Indigenous versus Western types of knowledges. And so my own knowledge of Indigenous knowledge systems come from these groups of people that I've had the privilege to learn from. And my work, engages all the three legs of sustainability, as have been mentioned in the introduction, right? The economic, the environmental, and the social. And I'll start off really talking through this social leg a little bit and how I think about my role in this research endeavor through the social leg. And most obviously, of course, I, as a white middle class researcher. I work in a post-colonial settler context in this social system. And even though we are currently on Zoom at the moment, we are using resources and engaging in the activities of the college itself, who owns certain lands. And we are working in and through those lands once utilized by the Edisto, the Yamasee, the Siwi, the Waccamaw still exist in the state of South Carolina, and so on. And yet we also are in a situation where just only about 3% of our College of Charleston students claim to have an Indigenous identity. I've had the pleasure of hosting Indigenous students in some of my classes. And if there's anyone certainly who has an Indigenous perspective that's here, I would love to hear from you at the end of this talk and hear your perspective on working through some of these issues as well. But a lot of who I end up talking to at the college are people that look like me and who want to serve the greater good and make for a more socially just universe and recognize our colonial context and do the work of decolonizing our methodologies. And this is so important because, our environmental sciences are some of the least diverse STEM fields out there. Less than 5% of our graduates in environmental sciences are Indigenous or of African American identity, and over 85% of our environmental nonprofit boards are white, meaning that we have struggles in serving all of the different social systems that are affected by climate change or any number of other environmental issues that affect our polity. And so, my work, I have a vision for my work being one of creating a climate for cross-cultural collaboration and sharing expert positions in this notion that I've already mentioned called decolonizing research. So moving to our environmental system and thinking about that, here are two images that capture the two spaces that I work in a lot, and how the climate crisis is rearing its head in these places. And of course, in Alaska, in the high Arctic, you can very clearly measure what some of these annual temperature changes has meant to warm years versus cold years. And of course, we see after 1980s is that rise in the annual temperatures in that space. Here, local to the low country, we of course have, many talk of storm surge risk and increasing in frequencies and intensities of hurricanes, and all of those kinds of effects of a sea level rise that will continue as our Earth warms. And, the boreal forest, the northern climate that I work in most frequently, it is the most rapidly changing ecosystem on the planet currently. There are massive changes in terms of biota, population densities of certain things, or disease flare-ups like certain diseases taking out whole forest systems. Again, having really we're at a tipping point when we're talking about boreal forest ecosystems and what is about to come in the coming decades. In our low country maritime ecosystem, many of you are likely familiarized with the notion of more frequent and more intense hurricanes, increasing storm surge and nuisance flooding, Vibrio disease happening in times of drought amongst our oyster species. And this maritime coastal system is one of the most populated ecosystems undergoing climate change in the United States for certain, if not the world. And of course, each of the peoples that I work with have varying experiences with the effects of these changes. In the boreal forest, people are literally struggling to eat every winter because they rely on a lot of those biota that are experiencing grave declines. Here in the low country, it is often Gullah communities or communities of lower socioeconomic status that are the ones that are most frequently experiencing nuisance flooding and the disruptions to daily life due to sea level rise. And so, how I think about dealing with this work is through this ecosystem stewardship model. Okay. And this is a set of ideas put out by the ecologist Terry Chapin et al. A couple different ways in a couple of different articles, as well as a book called Ecosystem Stewardship. And in the book, they describe in one column what are the assumptions that we make when we are doing steady state management, in other words, assuming that our ecosystems are not changing. Our reference point is to always try and manage for historic conditions. Well, if there's always a forest here, there's going to always be a forest here. Let's manage for forests into the future. That's that first column of steady state resource management. But in the second column, on the right-hand side is the notion of ecosystem stewardship as an approach to manage or think about our environments as always in flux. So our reference point is not the historic condition, but what are the projected trajectories of change in these given places? And I also want to point us out to two other elements on this chart, which is the role of research versus the role of the resource manager. The role of research is that in a steady state management condition, the idea is that managers get the facts and transfer findings and take action. They'll do certain things, and here is how we manage to always keep a forest, right? But under the ecosystem stewardship model, researchers and managers are led to a much more robust collaboration where there are continual learning loops in what is called an adaptive management framework, assuming that these trajectories of change might take us from a particular kind of forest to another kind of forest, or maybe we have to start managing for the regularity of nuisance flooding that isn't necessarily so irregular anymore, right? And the role of the resource manager, that second line there that I'm highlighting, is that it assumes under a steady state ecosystem, right, that the decision maker can just set the course. But instead, really, both researchers and managers under this idea of ecosystem stewardship is a facilitator who engages multiple stakeholders and groups to both respond to and shape future trajectories of change and nurture this thing that we're calling resilience. Okay. And so, really, in the work that I do as a white woman working with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities, I very much situate all of my work in fulfilling this role of facilitator primarily. Okay. And that is how I go about trying to accomplish a decolonized methodology in the work that I try and do. And so I'm going to be talking about a few of these different kinds of approaches and projects that I've been had the pleasure of being involved with. I call a lot of my approach a collaborative method of conversation, right? I do a lot of in-depth participant observations. For example, in this image, I was there was an attempt to teach me how to harvest shrimp with the shrimp net on St. Helena Island in particular is where this photo is shot. But the idea is that I try and learn not just the daily practices, but through those daily practices, learn more about the community struggles and challenges to working with more collaborative resource management arrangements to work toward these trajectories of change, okay? I also really engage in a practice of co-authorship. If a scholar or if an intellectual that I'm working with is not already recognized as an academic trained with a master's or a PhD, I really try and bring in that expert into the world of academia by allocating co-authorship kinds of statuses to the work that we are collaborating on, especially if it's cross-cultural knowledge that me as a white woman who grew up in New Jersey would not necessarily have immediate knowledge of. And another term for this kind of stuff is called knowledge co-production or co-producing knowledge. And really, to do effective knowledge co-production means to engage in multiple expertises. And for me, it's about engaging Indigenous knowledge systems and engaging Indigenous scholars and scholarships and making sure my politics of citation involve multiple Indigenous peoples who are also scholars, right? That I'm not just having a political practice of citing only other white scholars, but to make sure that my writing recognizes these multiple levels of expertise, both formal as well as informal, by my Indigenous collaborators and inspirers, shall I say, okay? And so, one of the things that I really, turn to in thinking about Indigenous knowledge is looking at some of the work done by Indigenous scholars on defining what it is they're talking about as the difference between Western scholarship and Indigenous scholarship, okay? And this is an earlier piece produced by a Yupik scholar. I'm going to point us to really the first two lines on here and then the last two lines on this particular chart, right? Where Western knowledge is understood as spirituality being centered in a single supreme being, and humans exercising dominion over nature to use it for personal and economic gain in the Western tradition, versus a traditional ecological knowledge approach, recognizing that spirituality is embedded in all elements of the cosmos and not just a single supreme being, as well as humans needing a responsibility for maintaining these relationships with the natural world. These first 2 points relate very closely to the last 2 points on this chart that I'm showing you, where it's conceptualized in Western traditions that there's a sense of separateness from and superiority over other forms of life, and that scientists tend to view the relationships of humans to nature as a one-way hierarchical imperative. Whereas the Yupik scholar, Oscar Quagli, notes that no, in the Indigenous tradition, there's often cultivated a sense of empathy and kinship with multiple forms of life, both, both organic and non-organic, by the way. And that, their view of a proper human relationship with nature is often a two-way transactional dialogue rather than a one-way. And again, I'm glad this is being recorded. So when looking back on the recording, feel free to look through what some of these other contrasting points had been made by Dr. Quagley. The important thing to note here is that, of course, these themselves are stereotypical positions and characteristics of Western knowledges as well as Indigenous knowledges, right? As I noted in the beginning, there are many, many different tribes and tribal traditions that go into what we talk about as Indigenous knowledge. And the same thing goes for when we talk about Western knowledge. There's a whole host of disciplines that go into this idea of what we're calling Western knowledge, with many different subtleties and intricacies here. But Indigenous peoples have needed to make this claim more broadly, that not only are Indigenous knowledges existing in parallel to that of Western expertises, but that they examine the world differently, and they lead to different ways of potentially living within our worlds that are changing. So, as one example of some of the work that I've done in Alaska is a paper that I co-authored with a gentleman by the name of Orville Huntington. Here he is in a photograph at a moose hunt that he invited me to visit him with, and watch and partake and take photographs and talk about our collaborations together. And really, through that work, he instructed greatly that yes, our Indigenous knowledge traditions are very much driven through our local observations and our actual fine scale observations of ecosystem changes, right? Whether they notice the population of moose is going up or down, or even the levels of the water behind him in this photograph. They know very clearly and can compare from year to year what these environmental changes are doing, and whether it is a directional change, meaning whether they're seeing change to another type of type of regime, and they literally are. A lot of these dynamics of their fall hunt, for example, are changing greatly, which has been deeply impacting their food security for the winter months. But also through this collaboration with Orville Huntington, I've learned also that it's important to note that Indigenous knowledge it is very much about recognizing the wisdom of that knowledge and how it contributes to a continued Indigenous conservation theory and practice. And as I've said, these are part of a larger decolonized research method approach, where you really need to allow for an equal sharing of the research agenda and a clear upon, agreed upon purpose for the use of the data that you're collaborating on. Again, my work with Orville Huntington was all about informing regulatory management under these conditions of change in the moose harvest, for example. And also, decolonized research methods means that each participant needs to assess their own biases and emotional responses to that cross-cultural collaboration. And so, in that early collaboration going moose hunting with people, I coming from New Jersey, I didn't grow up as a hunter, and I described initially these experiences with moose and moose hunting as violent. Whereas Orville Huntington said, no, that's not exactly how our perspective of a moose hunt is. And instead, he described a more spiritual experience of a moose giving himself to a hunter and to a person that respects the ecological universe that had fed that moose for all of its life. And so, my journey through these collaborations are to always examine these moments of difference as well as the similarities between my culture, the culture that I've come from, and the culture of the people who has chosen to share their lives with me. And so other collaborations have also, of course, led us to really look at oral tradition in both the Alaska Native communities that I've worked with, as well as the Gullah Geechee communities that I've worked with, and a lot of these traditions describe this more than human relationship, right? If you go back to the notion of Western sciences trying to identify a particular hierarchy or a dominance over nature, the indigenous tradition is doing something else, understanding a network of kin through all animals and non-humans in the ecosystem. And through this work, I've learned, that Indigenous knowledge is as much an approach to research questions and data as it is a collection about facts and about things that we might present to a policy maker. And just as an example of that, here is another collaboration that I took on with the same gentleman, Orville Huntington, and myself in responding to how Huntington wanted to talk about his own aunt, who's pictured here, a woman, an elder by the name of Catherine Atla, Koyukon elder, and he wanted to share his community's oral tradition that she described, and we both, Huntington and I, witnessed a community meeting where a climatologist was there describing climate change and the trajectories of climate change and how important it was to listen to local communities on how to adapt to these climate changes. And this elder, raised her hand and said, "Okay, here's what I want to tell you, Mr. Climatologist." And she went on this very long story that many people in the community were very familiar with, because it was a story in their and other Alaska Native communities called "The Man on the Moon." And Catherine Atlas said this: they must have studied the weather, how it's changing in Alaska since John somebody walk on the moon. That moon is put up there for a purpose, to control the weather. Like in August, it rain. It never snow in September. But now we've seen snow in September. We've seen rain all fall when it's freezing up. It's just all mixed, she said. And I was wondering that. They study that, she asked, since the man walk on the moon. And at that event, the climatologists really was taking her very literally, right? When we're talking about, the walk on the moon, when we're talking about the actual moon landing, we're talking about 1969, okay? And so that is how the climatologist was responding to this elder, saying, well, it really wasn't because we landed on the moon that the climate is changing. And after the event, Orville Huntington said, no, that climatologist didn't get the story at all. And so instead, what we did was collaborate on explaining that this story means very much about this notion that humans are not above all other creatures on Earth, that doing something like going to the moon is expressing a type of scientific endeavor, a hubris that maybe we as human beings need to start to put into check because of the ways that we've been altering our systems subsequent to the 1970s. And so, that really is the nature of the story that a lot of Alaska Natives repeat over and over and over again, but that if we, those of us that grew up in Western cultures and in Western sciences, might try and look for a literal translation of these indigenous knowledge systems that might not be where we need to be doing our interpretations. So, it's important to note that there are many differing assumptions between the ways that indigenous knowledge systems work and that of Western sciences. The causal mechanisms can appear different, like with this story about the man on the moon. And you have to be aware of the possibilities of a story acting in a different register than that of the fact that we often need to look for as social scientists trained in a Western science tradition. And as biologists and environmental scientists, we need to also start to think about the role of humans in the system as a driver that could produce both positive and negative feedbacks. In other words, it's not just humans causing bad stuff in the environment and causing our problems and causing climate change, but that there are things that people can do and ways in which we can be with these with the ways that we can do our daily lives and interact with our natural systems can also provide what is called a negative feedback, or a way to keep stasis in our natural systems. Okay, so not just negative in terms of bad, but negative in terms of the feedback, notion of feedbacks and stability in systems, and not just moving a system into a different state. And lastly, knowledge needs to be understood not just as facts about things to present as policymakers, but the indigenous knowledge holders themselves have wisdom to be able to speak from that position of expertise to already direct what some of these choices we need to make to adapt to our new futures. And so, I'll end too with thinking about this economic leg of our triple bottom line here. And pretty much all my collaborators insist that it's important to decenter capitalism in this economic leg, that it's important to help them articulate that their economic systems are a subsistence-based economy, a direct relationship with those environments without the necessity of cash as an intermediary to determine whether they have a good life. And so, in thinking about my Alaska Native collaborators, we could just see here, I mostly have worked in areas in Alaska in the darkest parts of this map, where, at least 316 pounds per person per year are harvested for the purpose of their daily subsistence needs. Okay, and we can certainly say that for Gullah Geechee communities have a deep dependence on coastal systems to provide for food around their table. Historically, that has been the case, and it's true through to today. My Alaska Native collaborators describe how this subsistence economy is one that deeply involves family, not just those who gather, but the others who help process and put their labors into processing the foods. Here's an image at a smokehouse that's been run. This particular smokehouse was constructed in the 1970s, but these people have been fishing this area for about 6,000 years, most generally. Here is another image of one of the wonderful women that have shown me how the best way to cut Chinook salmon. for the year's subsistence. And here are just some ways that these harvests are packaged and then shared or gifted to other places, to other families as part of a non-market exchange of subsistence resources like that of the Chinook, amongst many others that they do. And what I've been doing with Gullah Geechee in particular has been really trying to make visible their subsistence fishery as a fishery. And I've been working with a group called the Gullah Geechee Sustainability Think Tank for about 6 years now, whose membership is composed both of academics, Gullah and non-Gullah, as well as Gullah community members that represent the entire scope of the Gullah Geechee community, uh, that vet some of the research projects that academics would like to pursue in concert and in collaboration with their communities. And as I said, one of the earliest sort of requests by the Gullah Geechee communities that I've worked with is to articulate that they have what is called a subsistence fishery here in the Low Country, and also, help them frame themselves not just as a legal ethnic minority, which is their legal designation in the United States, but that they are indigenous knowledge holders that are carrying through their own indigenous traditions that have passed down for generations since they became a people across the Sea Islands. And I've been collaborating very closely with a woman by the name of Queen Quet, and Queen Quet had run a focus group of a group of fishers that basically tried to make this claim that saying we have to preserve our heritage and our way of fishing because these regulations are not recognizing our practice on the fishery as a subsistence fishery generative of our indigenous knowledge traditions. And he says, yeah, it's not sports fishing. What we're doing is subsistence fishing, but that legal category doesn't apply to my Gullah collaborators. And so other kinds of works that I've been doing with Gullah Geechee communities here is to also articulate the lack of access they are experiencing to the coast and to those resources that they used to rely on much more frequently. And so my goal as a white researcher working at the College of Charleston is to assist these communities in providing support for technical resources like GIS expertise that they may not have had easy access to. Okay. And so here are two maps that I had been requested to ask that map out all of the private water docks in Beaufort and in Mount Pleasant to compare with any of the public water access that still remains for accessibility by Gullah Geechee. And Queen Quet has said she has taken these maps to local management meetings to beg the policymakers not to allow for yet another private dock that could pollute the waters further and also contribute to the lack of access that her people has had to coastal systems. And as a last final example, back to Alaska, I have worked with these communities to map out where they have done their harvesting. And this is a literal map of the effects of climate change. We see in 1983, the moose harvest for these two indigenous communities of Alatna and Allakaket, just shy of the Arctic Circle. They pretty much could stay close to their own home villages in 1983 and in that decade for their moose harvest. But in research that I recently did in the last few years, funded by the National Park Service, we were able to show the ways in which their food systems have been stretched and stressed by climate change, meaning that people have had to spend a lot more money going out on the river, going farther to get their moose to feed themselves for the winter. And so, just in summary, these projects, this smattering of projects show how Indigenous knowledges could be engaged through a variety of collaborative social science methods to better understand ecosystem change and manage for ecosystem change. And by engaging Indigenous knowledges, you can also address how to live within these changing environments. So that's my talk. I hope I'll also just end with saying that our graduate program is collaborating with Queen-Quet again to have a celebration of Gullah Geechee freedom. Here is a link that I'll also put in the chat box for you to link to hear a little bit more about that collaboration. Tomorrow is a live stream, and you'll be able to view a choreo poem by the Gullah Geechee on their relationships to the land. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and let somebody else talk about the next events before we open up for Q&A.
Actually, it'd be great to just take a moment for some questions. So thank you so much, Annette, for that talk and for so much to think about. So anyone with questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will we'll get a chance to go through them, and then I'll use the last minute to talk a little bit about what's coming next. So our first question from Holly is, what does your future with and the future of sustainability with Indigenous people look like?
I mean, it's a future that is equally shared, right? Where the knowledge that we are coming up with as sustainability and environmental scholars, that policymakers are actually considering, are knowledges that come from local peoples as well as through more traditional practices of Western sciences. So I see a collaborative approach, and it's increasing, right? I mean, there's more and more money being plugged to through institutions like the National Science Foundation and like the National Park Service that want to engage communities that are not Western experts already. So that is my hope, and that is what I see going for the future.
Excellent. And then our next question from Kayla, really good question. Do you think there are barriers for BIPOC in the environmental science field? So for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the environmental science field?
I mean, there are multiple challenges that are talked about, right? In terms of who gets to control the research agenda, in terms of the lack of access of funding for students of color, and especially students that are Indigenous and African American students of color. The intersectional identities obviously really affect a variety of people in becoming the next generation of quote unquote experts in the environmental field. And so that's why I think it's important to recognize that expertise is not just to be had with a few letters after one's name, but to recognize these traditionalists, whether traditional agriculturalists, traditional hunters, traditional fishers, and their direct knowledges. But there are many things that we can do at CFC in our different programs to better allow a pathway for non-whites to access the academy.
Yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Our next question is from Todd. How do we not romanticize and appropriate, especially when trying to move beyond Western hierarchies that see the world as inanimate?
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to from my position as a white person to romanticize these traditions. And and so that again, that's why I go back to co-authorship. A lot of my work is co-authored. And in fact, that work that I referenced on the moose hunt, I was already doing, my work in describing the moose hunt was already providing a particular perspective. But because we co-authored in the way that we co-authored, where in that paper, I allowed myself to talk about my own perspectives and how I viewed this moose hunt versus the hunter himself was able to say, yeah, it's not really a violent act. Here's how we actually think about our own act. As long as we as scholars leave space for people to represent themselves, I think we are less vulnerable to romanticizing or stereotyping or misrepresenting people other than our own positionalities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annette. A question from Darcy. Are there any municipalities or governments that are integrating Indigenous knowledge in a meaningful way in their policy development?
I mean, I think there's a lot of efforts to do community-based research. I think the South Carolina Sea Grant has done many wonderful things in outreach to many different constituencies, not just Indigenous, but to thinking through all of our, working waterfront people in the actual industry of fishing, for example. This is a movement in natural resource management more broadly to create and develop skills to work across different perspectives. And it is increasingly tagged onto. Certainly, that the National Park Service asked me to do the study with those Alaska Native tribes is also a great evidence that this is the now of how to manage for our future environments.
Okay, so we have a question from Abigail. Do you think that it would be valuable for our education system on the primary and secondary level to provide more Indigenous education from an Indigenous perspective rather than a Western perspective?
100%, yeah. And there is a whole literature too, called place-based learning, right? The idea of place and the local is so central to what it means for Indigenous identity and what it means for Indigenous knowledges. And there are many scholars that have been working on K through 12 education for Indigenous students and for others, to expose others to alternative methods of more place-based education as ways of thinking beyond some of our Western traditions of education. So, if you ever want to reach out to me, I can give you a couple names. But definitely Indigenous education. If you look that up in Google Scholar, there is a growing literature on how to do that.
Excellent. So unless anyone else has questions, we have one remaining one from Jay. What is, but most importantly, what more can an institution like the College of Charleston do to support local communities such as the Gullah Geechee community in these struggles, such as with policies on fishing and things like that?
Yeah, I think the college right now is poised to be doing some amazing things. I think, you know, the really hard look at names across campus is something that's being undergone right now, and justifiably so, because we need to create a safer space for multiple kinds of peoples to want to become members of the College of Charleston in the first place. And I think we need to have a space that does not that is more welcoming in the first place. And I'll say, our graduate program works out at a place that is now called Stono Preserve. And it took many years, but that place was called Dixie Plantation. And my collaborator, Queen Quet, didn't want to step foot on that land until it had a new name on it. And so we really literally couldn't start our collaborations until the college, finally made that decision to rename that space Stono Preserve. And so any kinds of ways like that, that the college can become a more welcoming space for these perspectives and recognitions of these histories, is a step forward to doing things like even involving more folks to be focused on this issue of policies of regulating fishing.
Thank you so much for your wonderful answers to these questions and for the presentation. You've given us all a lot to think about. If we could just take a moment to thank Annette for being here with us today. I've put in the chat box a little bit about what's coming. So you can follow us on social media at Sustain CFC. This talk, along with our other talks, will be in our YouTube page on our website. If you want to take the climate pledge along with other people, you can go on sustaincfc.edu to take the climate pledge. And we will have one more of these presentations this semester, the Climate Friday presentation on November 6th, right after the election. So that'll be a really interesting time. From 1 to 2, we'll be hearing from Alexis Carrico and Dr. Matthew Nowlin in the Political Science Department. Alexis is in the Econ Department, presenting on the economics of climate change, why business as usual will be a disaster. And if you keep an eye out on our social media next Friday, we have another social media takeover. The Gullah Society is going to be providing us with some action items. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks again so much, Annette. This was really wonderful. We really appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for coming and for the great questions. My pleasure. And feel free to email me.